The data came in wrong for the third time in a row, and that was when Eli Varek knew it wasn't the instruments. He had been awake for 19 hours in the observation bay of the Meridian Cross, a mid-tier research vessel that smelled permanently of recycled oxygen and burnt solder, and his eyes were doing the thing they did when exhaustion set in, the left one, his mother's eye, pale gray and human, drifting slightly before he caught it. The right eye didn't drift. It never did. It was amber, nearly gold, with a vertical pupil that contracted sharply in the blue light of his display screens, a gift from a father he had never met, from a species that saw in spectrums humans hadn't bothered to name yet. He pressed 2 fingers to his temple and looked again at the star catalogue. 47 stars. 47 in the last 11 days. Not supernovae. He would have welcomed supernovae. A supernova made sense. A supernova was a star exhausting itself, collapsing under its own accumulated mass, screaming its end across 10,000 light-years in a burst that outshone entire galaxies for weeks. Violent, yes. Catastrophic, certainly. But logical. What the catalogue showed was not logical. What it showed was 47 stars, ranging from red dwarfs to mid-sequence yellows to one blue-white giant that should have burned for another 4 billion years, simply stopping. Luminosity to 0 in under 6 seconds. No precursor dimming. No coronal fluctuation. No gravitational signature of collapse. Just light, and then the absolute, geometric, perfect nothing where light had been. Eli pulled up the spatial map and told the ship's rendering system to plot each event as a point in 3-dimensional space. The holographic field above his work table filled with stars, thousands of them, the local stellar neighborhood rendered in faint blue, each living star a soft pulse of gold. And then, superimposed over them, 47 points in red. Dead stars. Silent coordinates. He stared at the pattern for a long time. His left eye saw the randomness first, the human half of his brain reaching for noise, for the comfortable explanation that tragedy had no geometry. But his right eye, the amber one, began to trace something underneath the randomness, a structure his father's blood recognized before he could articulate it. He rotated the map, tilted it 30 degrees on the vertical axis. The points didn't align into a line or a grid. They aligned into a spiral. A tightening spiral, each successive extinction point closer to the center of the formation than the last, the interval between events decreasing as the sequence progressed, 11 days for the first cluster, 8 for the second, 5 for the third. The gaps were collapsing inward like a held breath. He found the center of the spiral almost before he wanted to. A yellow dwarf. G-type. 4.6 billion years old, comfortably mid-sequence, orbited by 8 planets, the third of which was wet and blue and carried 7 billion human beings on its surface. So, Earth's sun. Eli sat very still for a moment. Then he pulled up the interval calculations and ran them 3 times, adjusting for relativistic reporting delays, for the distance distortions of stellar cartography at these scales, for every variable he could think of that might introduce error. Each time, the answer came back the same. The interval between extinctions was having on a predictable curve. At the current rate of compression, the spiral would reach its center, would reach Sol, in 72 hours. He picked up his comms tab and opened the ship-wide channel. "I need everyone in the observation bay," he said. "Right now." They came in the order he expected. Dara Souza first, because she was never really asleep, because she ran on 4 hours and adrenaline and a deep personal suspicion of stillness. She was the Meridian Cross's chief navigator, short and dark-haired and relentlessly competent, with a kind of face that made people feel she was assessing them for structural weaknesses even in casual conversation. Behind her came Yusuf Chen, the ship's engineer, a broad man in his late 40s who moved through the narrow corridors of the vessel the way water moves through a tight pipe, without complaint, finding the path. Last came Priya Anand, the mission xenologist and, technically, Eli's superior on this research charter, which both of them found awkward given that she was 26 and he was 34 and she had the professional authority to override his findings but not the experience to evaluate them. None of them were fully dressed. None of them looked happy to be there. "This had better be real," Dara said, not sitting down. "Define real," Eli said, and turned the holographic map toward them. He walked them through it without editorializing. He had learned early, had learned it the hard way, through years of watching colleagues dismiss his analyses because of the eye, because of the subtle structural differences in his facial bones, because of the low-frequency resonance in his voice that human ears processed as wrong without being able to say exactly why, that the data had to speak first. His interpretation could come after. He showed them the 47 events. He showed them the spiral. He showed them the interval compression. He showed them the center. Priya was quiet for a long time. Then, the instruments misread. I recalibrated 4 times, Eli said. Cross-referencing with galactic observatory relays. The relays confirmed 12 of the 47 independently. I extrapolated the rest from triangulation and proper motion data. The pattern holds either way. Yusuf was leaning over the table, studying the spiral with the expression he wore when he was load-bearing a problem he didn't yet have the vocabulary to solve. "What does this?" he asked. "To a star." "What does it?" "I don't know yet," Eli said. "What's your theory?" Dara asked, and her voice was flat, not hostile, but carrying the particular flatness that meant she had already identified the thing she was going to push back on. Eli looked at the map. He had been thinking about this since the pattern resolved itself, turning it over in the part of his mind that operated below language, in the register where his father's inheritance lived, a capacity for pattern recognition that went beyond the statistical, that touched something he had never been able to fully explain to human colleagues without watching their faces close. He had been sitting with the thought for 2 hours, testing it against every alternative, and every alternative had collapsed. "I think someone is doing this on purpose," he said. "And I think we have 72 hours to stop it." The observation bay was quiet. Outside its reinforced viewports, the stars burned on, indifferent and ancient and, for the moment, still present. Eli watched his crewmates absorb what he had said, watched their faces perform the calculation that every human face performed when confronted with a truth that was too large. The brief contraction, the instinct to minimize, the slow reluctant opening into belief. "Then we'd better figure out who," Priya said at last. They ran the Meridian Cross hard toward the leading edge of the spiral, toward the coordinates of the most recent extinction, pushing the ship's drives to a sustained output that made the hull groan in long, low harmonics like a cathedral settling. The vessel was not built for this. It was a research ship, a slow and methodical thing designed to park at a safe distance from interesting phenomena and observe them with patience. Its emergency drives were meant for orbital breakaways and debris evasion, not sustained interstellar sprinting. Yusuf spent the first 4 hours in the engine room with his hands literally inside the drive housing, coaxing the fusion manifolds to sustain a thrust curve they were not rated for, and he came back to the observation bay with burns on both forearms and the expression of a man who had made peace with an outcome he still objected to. "I bought us maybe 30% more thrust," he said. "Don't ask me how. And don't ask me for how long." "How long?" Eli asked. Yusuf looked at him without warmth. "I said don't ask." This was the texture of life on the Meridian Cross for Eli Varek. Had been, in fact, for the 6 months since he'd joined this charter. Not hostility, exactly. Nothing crude enough to name. More a kind of ambient caution, a withholding of the small frictions and casual intimacies that made up the social connective tissue of a crew confined together in a 140-meter vessel. Yusuf would answer his questions but not volunteer information. Dara would defer to his expertise in meetings and avoid sitting next to him at meals. Priya was the closest thing he had to a genuine colleague, but even she had a habit of pausing before she agreed with him, of letting a beat of silence intervene between his analysis and her endorsement, a beat that said, "I'm checking this against my own instincts before I let you lead me." He had grown up in this pause. Had been born into it, in a sense, the son of Dr. Avelini Varek, a xenobiologist from Lyon, and a being whose species had no permanent name in any human language, who had been his mother's research subject and then her companion and then gone, departed back to his own kind before Eli was old enough to have memories. What Eli had instead of memories was the amber eye and the resonance in his voice and the pattern recognition and the persistent low-grade experience of being not quite trusted in rooms full of people who shared a category he did not fit cleanly into. He had learned to work around it. He had learned to let the data speak first. Now, in the ship's small galley while Dara plotted their intercept course and Yusuf monitored the straining drives, Eli sat with Priya across a bolted-down table and talked through what he knew about the Umbral. Because he had known. Since the pattern resolved. Since the spiral's geometry made itself clear in the three-dimensional rendering. He had known the name, had felt its surface from the xenological literature he had read obsessively in his early 20s, when he was trying to understand what half of him was, trying to map the broader taxonomy of intelligent life in a galaxy that turned out to be, against all early human expectation, extraordinarily crowded. The Umbral were ancient, Estimates place their emergence at somewhere between 800 million and 1.2 billion years ago, which made them older than complex animal life on Earth. They were not aggressive in the way that word normally implied. They did not raid, did not conquer, did not seek resources or territory or dominance in any sense that mapped onto patterns humanity recognized. What they sought was the elimination of light. Not metaphorically. Literally. Their cosmological philosophy, Eli said, if you can call it that, and I think you have to because it governs everything they do, is that the universe's natural state is darkness. Perfect, absolute darkness. That stars are an aberration. A kind of infection. He paused. The Umbral believe they are physicians. Priya stared at him. They're extinguishing stars because they think they're curing the universe. They've done it before. There are 17 anomalous stellar voids in the galactic record, regions with statistically improbable star density gaps that can't be explained by natural formation history. The xenological community mostly treated them as curiosities. I think they're old treatment sites. How do you know about this? Her voice was careful. Not accusatory, but aware. Because half my father's species literature is about them, Eli said. The Umbral have been doing this for 800 million years. A lot of species know to be afraid of them. Your father's species. I don't know what they are, he said, and meant it to close the line of inquiry gently. I know some of what they know. It's in the genetic architecture somewhere. I access it like a library where I know some books exist but can't always find the shelves. Priya was quiet. Then, and you're only telling us this now? I'm telling you as I'm certain, he said. I didn't want to name them until I was sure. Naming the Umbral to a crew that's already not entirely comfortable with my presence, and being wrong about it would have cost us time we don't have. She looked at him for a moment with something that might, in different circumstances, have become trust. Then she opened her tablet and started pulling up everything in the ship's xenological database on the Umbral. There was not much. A few fragmented survey records. A disputed set of observational logs from a hegemony deep space probe that had gone silent in a region subsequently noted for anomalous stellar behavior. A theoretical paper from 15 years ago by a xenobiologist at the Kepler Institute who had proposed the Umbral as a possible explanation for the void anomalies and been largely ignored. It's not enough to stop them, Priya said. No, Eli agreed. But I have a theory. He had been building it since the pattern resolved. It lived in the same below-language register where the recognition had happened, assembling itself from the physics he knew, the stellar physics, the quantum radiation mechanics, the wave propagation dynamics of high-energy photonic events, and from something older, something inherited, a structural understanding of how the Umbral's technology worked that he could not source to any specific memory and could not entirely explain but trusted with a certainty that was physical, that he felt in his chest. The Umbral did not destroy stars. They silenced them. They projected a field. He had no better word, though field was imprecise, that collapsed the electromagnetic output of a stellar body into a localized null state. It was, in principle, like noise cancellation, a precisely computed destructive interference pattern layered over the star's radiated energy, cancelling it to zero at the source. Sustained by a distributed network of projector nodes that had to be held in a precise geometric relationship to one another to maintain the destructive interference. If the geometry broke, if the node positions were disrupted significantly enough, the cancellation field would collapse. The star would reignite. Violently. But one node going offline would not do it. The network had redundancy. It would compensate, reconfigure, redistribute the load to surviving nodes. To collapse the field entirely, you needed to disrupt all of it at once. You needed a shockwave large enough to sweep through the entire node formation simultaneously. And the only thing that could generate that kind of shockwave was a supernova-scale event. You would need to detonate a star. He had been sitting with this for 2 hours and had not yet found the hole in it. They'll have the node network positioned around Sol already, he said. In final preparation. We find the network. We find a candidate star close enough that the supernova shockwave will reach the nodes before they can reposition. We trigger the detonation, and the wave disrupts the field entirely. Priya stared at him. You want to blow up a star? On purpose? Yes. And the shockwave, the radiation, will also hit the Umbral fleet, he said. Whatever ships they have positioned around the node network. Yes. The galley was very quiet. The ship groaned around them. You're describing killing an unknown number of beings, Priya said softly. I'm describing a choice between that and the death of Sol, Eli said. Which means Earth. Which means every human colony in the inner system. 7 billion people on the ground alone, plus. I understand the math, she said. I'm not sure I do, Dara said from the galley doorway. Eli had not heard her arrive. She had been listening. Her face was unreadable. But I understand the clock. 61 hours left. Where's the candidate star? Eli pulled up his map. There was a candidate. He had identified it an hour ago and had been hoping something more palatable would present itself. It hadn't. The star was called Vesta, 7 in the human catalog. An aging subgiant, 6.3 light-years from Sol, already in the early stages of helium shell burning, already, in stellar terms, leaning toward the exit. Its outer layers were expanded and diffuse, its core under increasing pressure. It needed very little encouragement. And it had, orbiting it in a stable Lagrange configuration, an automated mining platform and one small human colony. Eli told them about the colony after a pause that was, he knew, 1 second too long. Dara caught it. How small? 312 registered residents, he said. It's a geothermal extraction station. Mostly automated. The population is largely support staff. Mostly, Dara said. We'd have to warn them first, Priya said. Give them time to evacuate. We'd have about 4 hours between our arrival and the window when we'd need to trigger the event, Eli said. 4 hours to warn them, coordinate an evac, and... Then the alert came in. The alert came from the Galactic Observatory Relay Network, an automated burst transmission, the kind that the relay system sent when its monitoring instruments detected a stellar-class event. Eli saw it first because he was still at the display console, and he pulled it open with the cold, practiced efficiency of a scientist who has spent years training himself not to flinch at data before he understands it. He understood it very quickly. Vesta 7's luminosity had dropped to 0 4 minutes ago. He stood very still at the console for a moment. Then he checked the coordinate confirmation. Then he checked it again. Then he called the others back, and he showed them, and nobody said anything for a while. The Umbral had accelerated their sequence. They're not following the original interval anymore, he said. His voice came out flat because he needed it to be flat. The alternative was something he could not afford. The spiral is compressing faster than my model predicted. Either my interval calculation was wrong, or they changed their pace. Why would they change pace? Yusuf asked. Because they detected us moving toward the leading edge of the spiral, Eli said. Because we've been running the drives at 30% above rated output for 4 hours and we're not subtle about it. He paused. They know someone noticed. Dara was staring at the extinction coordinates on the display. Vesta 7. Where, 43 seconds ago, there had been a star. Where there was now a dark mass still hot enough to be detected on infrared but radiating nothing in the visible spectrum. A silence that had been, 20 minutes before, a sun burning at 6,000 Kelvin, warming a small world, illuminating a sky, giving energy to the hydroponics bays and the solar panels and the observation deck of Kandara Station, where 312 people had been going about the ordinary business of their lives. The colony alert system would have fired when the light went out. Eli knew this without having to look it up. It was standard protocol for any solar-dependent installation. When the star stops, the alert fires. But the alert was a preparation protocol for a known possibility. Stellar weather, coronal events, temporary flux, not for the extinction of the star itself. Not for the absolute, total, permanent removal of their sun. The heaters would run on battery backup for approximately 6 hours. The hydroponics lights would switch to emergency power. And then the cold would begin, in the particular way that cold begins when there is no longer any body in the solar system radiating heat, when the temperature is not declining toward some lower point but falling freely, with no floor, toward the 2.7 Kelvin background temperature of deep space. 312 people. Eli ran the numbers automatically, because he was the kind of person whose mind ran numbers even when he didn't want it to, and the numbers told him that by the time any rescue vessel could reach Kandara Station's coordinates, the temperature in the habitat modules would be below the threshold for biological survival. The colony had emergency survival suits rated to -80°C, but without heat generation, the suits would fail in approximately. He stopped running the numbers. "We keep going," Dara said. Her voice was entirely steady, which Eli recognized, from 6 months of learning her voice, as a form of grief she was performing as resolve. "We can't get to them in time. We all know that. So we keep going." She looked at Eli. "Your candidate star is gone. What's the next option?" There were 3 other candidate stars in the right range, close enough to Sol that a supernova shockwave would reach the Umbral node network in time to disrupt it before they completed the sequence. But Vesta 7 had been the most advanced in its evolutionary stage, the most amenable to triggered detonation. Of the remaining 3, one was too stable, would require a level of energy input to trigger that the Meridian Cross could not generate. The second was viable but positioned such that its shockwave vector would reach the Umbral nodes at a grazing angle, possibly insufficient to collapse the interference field network completely. The third was a red dwarf, 22 years past its instability window, technically triggerable but with a yield that Eli's calculation suggested would be, at best, marginal. "There's a fourth option," he said. "But it wasn't on my list because I classified it as too dangerous." "Everything on your list is too dangerous," Yusuf said, and the way he said it, dry, flat, tired, was the most collegial thing he had said to Eli in 6 months. "There's a binary system," Eli said. HR 7440. A contact binary, 2 stars in such close orbit that they're actually sharing their outer envelope. They've been in a mass transfer relationship for approximately 12,000 years. The primary is accreting mass from the secondary at a rate that's already past the theoretical threshold for a Type Ia event. They're not a trigger problem, they're a timing problem. They're going to detonate on their own eventually. Could be next year. Could be in 50,000 years. The uncertainty window is enormous. "But if we pushed them," Priya said. "If we pushed them, if we introduced the right perturbation to the mass transfer rate, we could collapse the timing window to hours. Maybe less." He paused. The yield would be approximately 40 times greater than a standard core collapse supernova. Silence. "The shockwave would reach the Umbral nodes," he continued, "in about 90 minutes from detonation, given their current projected positions. The intensity at that range would be..." He looked at the number he had calculated and felt something shift in his chest. "There would be no fleet. There would be no nodes. Whatever the Umbral have in that formation would be vaporized." "Would the shockwave reach Sol?" Dara asked. "At that range, with standard interstellar medium attenuation, no. The EM pulse would add some high-energy particle flux to the heliosphere, but Earth's magnetosphere would handle it. Standard aurora event, probably. No structural damage." Priya was looking at him with the expression she wore when she was trying to determine if she was being led somewhere she shouldn't go. "You've already set the course, haven't you?" she said. Not a question. He had not. But he had already worked out the intercept vector. And she had read that on him somewhere, in the angle of his shoulders, or the quality of his stillness, or whatever signal his alien half broadcast in frequencies that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to instinct. "I haven't set anything," he said. "This is a crew decision." They looked at each other, Dara, Yusuf, Priya, in the wordless way that people who have lived in close quarters develop, a shorthand of glances that carries full arguments in half a second. Then Dara sat down at the navigation console. "Give me the coordinates," she said. 48 hours left. The Meridian Cross burned toward HR 7440 at the edge of her tolerance, and the stars outside the viewports were steady and gold and wrong, because Eli knew now that every one of them was a target, that somewhere in the dark between them the Umbral were positioned with their node networks and their ancient conviction that light was a sickness and darkness was the cure. He stood at the observation viewport for a long time, watching nothing in particular, and thought about Kandara Station. He thought about what it looked like, probably. He had never been there, but the station architecture for geothermal extraction facilities was standardized, and he could picture the habitat ring, the observation deck that the promotional materials always included because people would not go to the outer system without some amenity, the hydroponics bays with their bright artificial lights now running on emergency power, ticking down. He thought about 312 people watching the dark where their sun had been and understanding, slowly, what it meant. The communications staff sending burst transmissions to the relay network. the medical officer dispensing the medication that protocol required in crisis situations. The children, if there were children, the record said there were 17 registered minors on the station, watching the dark. He thought about this with the full weight of it, and did not look away from the weight, and did not tell himself that it was acceptable, because it was not acceptable, it was catastrophic, it was 312 human lives, and it had happened because the Umbral had accelerated their sequence and because he had not found the pattern fast enough. He stayed with that for a while. Then he went back to his console and worked on the detonation calculations, because the 312 were already beyond what he could do, and the 7 billion on Earth were not, and he was the only person on the ship who understood enough of the physics to work out the triggering mechanism, and so the only thing he could do that was worth anything was continue. Yusuf found him there, 3 hours later. The engineer sat down across from him without being invited, which itself was new. Eli kept his eyes on his work, not wanting to do anything that might cause Yusuf to reconsidering whatever had brought him here. "My family's in Nairobi," Yusuf said. "I know," Eli said. He didn't know, actually, but it seemed right to say. "I need you to not be wrong about this," Yusuf said. Eli looked up from his console. Yusuf was looking at him directly, not past him, not to the left of him where the alien eye was, but at him, the way people had to consciously decide to look at him. "I know," Eli said, which was the true answer this time. Yusuf nodded slowly. Then he looked at the display screens, at the calculations Eli had been running. "You need the perturbation to hit the mass transfer point at the L2 of the secondary," he said, "to maximize the rate change. I've done binary stellar mechanics. Not this scale, but—" "The principle holds," Eli said. "Same math. What are you using as the perturbation source? We don't have anything like the payload you'd need." "The ship," Eli said. Yusuf stared at him. "Not the crew," Eli said quickly. "Not us. The drive core. We bring the Meridian Cross to the right position, lock the autopilot on a collision course for the L2 point, output maximum power through the drive until the moment of impact. That gives us the mass and the energy input we need. I've run it 6 times. It's enough to push the mass transfer rate past the detonation threshold. And we leave in the 2 emergency escape pods. They're rated for interstellar drift. The shockwave will reach us before any rescue vessel does, but the pod's radiation shielding is," he checked the figures, "marginal. Survivable. Probably." "Probably," Yusuf repeated. "It's what I have," Eli said. Yusuf sat with this. He was the kind of man who processed information physically. Eli had noticed. His hands would move, his weight would shift, his breathing would change its rate. He watched Yusuf do this and said nothing, gave him the time, understood that this was a person who could be trusted if the mechanism of trust was allowed to run at its own speed. "Okay," Yusuf said finally. "Show me the drive calculations." 2 pairs of eyes. HR 7440 filled the viewports like something that should not exist in any aesthetic sense, in the sense that reality rarely permitted itself the extremity of beauty that pure physics occasionally generated. The 2 stars were so close that their outer envelopes had merged into a single elongated body, stretched between their gravitational centers into an ellipsoid the color of old copper and new gold, a vast bridge of fusing plasma connecting 2 dying suns as one fed on the other. The mass transfer stream was visible to the naked eye as a luminous river running from the secondary to the primary, a continuous cascade of stellar material moving at hundreds of kilometers per second, feeding a fire that was already, from any human-scale perspective, incomprehensibly large. It was the most magnificent thing Eli had ever seen, and he stood at the viewport for approximately 10 seconds appreciating it before he went back to his work. 22 hours left. "The Umbral node network is in position," he said. He was reading from the passive sensor array, interpreting the subtle gravitational microsignatures of the node formation around Sol's coordinate region. The nodes themselves were invisible, dark matter constructs, he suspected, or technology so far beyond human material science that the difference was academic, but their gravitational signatures, spread over light hours, were faint and unmistakable if you knew what you were reading. "They're in final configuration. If they activate the silence field now, then we have even less time than we thought," Priya said. She was at the secondary console, monitoring the node network signatures while Eli worked on the detonation approach. "Can we tell when they're going to?" "When Sol's luminosity begins to drop," Eli said. "That'll be the first measurable indicator." We'll have maybe 3 minutes from first dimming to total extinction. And the shockwave travel time from HR 7440 to Sol is 90 minutes, Dara said from navigation. From detonation to node network disruption, yes. Which means we need to trigger the detonation 93 minutes before they activate. We need to trigger it, he checked the countdown, in the next 3 hours. And we need 2 hours to set up the drive for the collision approach, Yusuf called from the engine room. His voice was coming through the ship's intercom, accompanied by the sound of access panels being removed and the sharp, specific percussion of a person doing careful work very fast. Then we start now, Eli said. The preparation was, in its way, the most quietly devastating thing Eli had ever done, because it was intimate with the ship in a way that made him feel the loss of it before it happened. The Meridian Cross was not his ship. He had no sentimental claim to it, had joined this charter from a position posting with a 3-paragraph cover letter that Priya's department had responded to in under a day, probably because half-alien xenophysicists with his specific profile were not common. But he had lived inside this hull for 6 months, had learned its sounds, had spent hundreds of hours in this observation bay with its particular configuration of screens and the faint scratch on the viewport glass that he had always meant to ask about and never had. Handing the ship over to its final course felt, irrationally, like a kind of burial. He set up the autopilot collision trajectory with Dara standing beside him. She had asked to be there and he had not argued, had understood that she needed to see every step of what was being done with her navigation systems. She caught 2 errors in his initial vector calculations, both small, neither negligible. He corrected them without defensiveness and thanked her, and she nodded once with an expression that was not forgiveness exactly but was in the same family as forgiveness. The escape pods were loaded in silence. 2 pods, 2 to a pod, Priya with Yusuf, Dara with Eli. Eli had proposed this allocation and nobody had contested it, which he took as a significant datum. Dara had simply said, "Fine," and begun loading her gear with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything. Whether she had agreed because she trusted him now, or because she wanted to keep him in view, he could not fully determine. He was willing to accept the ambiguity. He made one last pass through the observation bay, picked up nothing, put his hand for a moment flat against the viewport glass. The binary system blazed beyond it, the mass transfer stream pulsing in slow, enormous rhythms. Inside that stream, the conditions were already past the threshold. The physics was already waiting. He was not creating something. He was releasing a tension that existed independently of him, that the universe had been building toward at its own pace, and he was simply moving the timeline. He told himself this, and it helped a little, and he was aware that it only helped a little. "Eli," Dara said from the pod bay. "It's time." He initiated the drive sequence from the navigation console with 40 minutes to the window. The Meridian Cross acknowledged the command sequence in the placid, unhurried way of ship systems, running through its pre-burn checklist with the patience of software that did not know it was about to die. Eli watched the checklist progress and felt the vibration change under his feet as the drive spun up to the power levels Yusuf had coaxed out of it over the last 6 hours, past rated output, past safe output, past the threshold that had produced the burns on Yusuf's forearms, pushing into the range where the drive was, in effect, also beginning to fail even as it produced the energy they needed. A kind of mutual expenditure. The ship spending itself. He ran one final check on the detonation math. The Meridian Cross, massing approximately 14,000 metric tons and carrying a drive core producing 3.2 terawatts of output at this setting, would strike the secondary star at the L2 Lagrange point of the binary, the precise location where the gravitational balance between the 2 stars was most sensitive to perturbation. The impact would introduce a disruption to the mass transfer geometry sufficient to increase the accretion rate onto the primary by an estimated factor of 12. The primary, already at the Chandrasekhar mass limit and needing only a gentle additional burden to collapse, would respond within minutes. The collapse would initiate a Type Ia supernova with an estimated energy release of approximately 1.4 times 10 to the 44 joules. The shockwave would move outward at a significant fraction of the speed of light. In 93 minutes, it would reach the coordinate region of Sol. The node network would not survive the EM pulse and high-energy particle flux. The Umbral ships would not survive it. The silence field around Sol would never complete its initialization. And in roughly 4 minutes after detonation, the shockwave would also reach the escape pods. He had calculated the shielding margins. He had done this 17 times. The answer was always that the pods would survive, with high probability, If the crew members inside had taken the full anti-radiation protocol from the medical kit, which they had, and if the pod orientation was correct to put the heavy shielding panels between them and the detonation, which Dara had already confirmed she would handle, because navigation was her domain and she had asked to have the things she was good at. He was, in the end, asking everyone to trust a margin. "It's going to work," Priya said, beside him in the pod. She did not say it the way people say things to make themselves feel better. She said it the way she evaluated data, deliberately, having checked it. "Yes," Eli said. Dara was at the pod's small control panel, orientation thrusters warm, watching the trajectory of the Meridian Cross on the pod's abbreviated sensor display. The ship was moving now, had been moving since he initiated the sequence, was moving away from them on its final approach to the binary system, growing smaller in the pod's exterior camera, and he watched it go with a specific quality of attention he paid to things that he understood he would not see again. "Pod launch in 90 seconds, Yusuf's voice said from Pod 2. "We'll go over here." "Go here," Dara confirmed. The launch was rough, it always was, in emergency pods, which were designed for urgency and not comfort, which ejected with a pneumatic punch that snapped Eli's head back against the padded cradle and left a high tone in his right ear that was, he suspected, the world's quietest compliment to his alien inner ear architecture for handling it better than a human's would have. Then the pod's own orientation thrusters fired, rotating them on Dara's guidance to put the shielding panels toward the binary system, and Eli watched through the pod's narrow aft viewport as the Meridian Cross diminished into the blazing backdrop of HR 7440, becoming a small dark shape against the immense luminous ellipsoid of the contact binary, and then smaller, and then, in the moment before it struck, nothing visible at all. He counted. 3 seconds. 4. 7. Then HR 7440 stopped being a binary system and started being a god. The light hit the pod shielding first, which meant the sensors screamed and the alerts screamed, and Dara's hands were on the thruster controls adjusting their orientation with the cool precision of a person who is afraid but will not allow fear into her hands, and through the aft viewport, through the viewport which was rated for a specific fraction of this energy level and which Eli was acutely aware was on the edge of its rating. He watched the most violent event in local stellar history unfold in complete silence, because vacuum, because there was no medium for the sound to travel through, and so the end of 2 stars announced itself as light. Just light. It was white, not the white of human experience, not the white of clouds or paper or laboratory fluorescence, but a white that contained every frequency simultaneously at magnitudes that made the concept of color meaningless, a white that his human eye resolved as simply brilliant and his amber eye broke into a spectrum that had no names in any language he had been taught. Frequencies running from far below the visible into registers that existed in his father's inheritance as concepts he had no words for, as experiences rather than wavelengths. He watched this for exactly as long as it was safe to watch it, which was not long. Then the shockwave hit the pod. It was not the physical shockwave, that would never reach them, there was no medium for it in the interstellar void. What hit them was the E-impulse and the photon pressure wave and the high-energy particle flux, and it hit the shielding panels with a force that transmitted through the hull as a sound like the universe clearing its throat, and the pod spun, and the thrusters fired in automatic compensation, and in the spin Eli saw for one tumbling half-second the detonation expanding outward in all directions at once, a sphere of released energy that already measured in light minutes and was still growing, and, at its leading edge, traveling ahead of even the fastest particle flux, was the EM wavefront, racing toward the node network, racing toward the Umbral fleet, racing at the speed of light toward the coordinate region of Sol, carrying the message that the sequence was ended, that the silence field would not complete its initialization, that whatever they had planned for the small yellow star at the center of that small solar system would not come to pass. The pod stabilized. The alerts stopped screaming. The shielding had held, slightly above his highest estimated margin, which meant he had been conservative, which was either good science or good luck, and right now he was grateful for either. He looked at Dara, who was breathing steadily and deliberately, 2 counts in, 2 counts out, the breathing of someone who has trained for this and is using the training. "Pod 2, Dara said into the comms. "Status." "Intact," Yusuf said. His voice was rough. Priya's got a head wound. "Superficial." "We're intact." "Eli," Dara said. Not to the comms. To him. "Intact," he said. She nodded. Her hands were still on the thruster controls, not because she needed them there, but because she needed somewhere to put her hands. He understood this. In the shielded display, which was receiving attenuated sensor data now that the worst of the pulse had passed. He could see the wave front propagating outward. Could see the region where the Umbral fleet had been. The node showed nothing now. No gravitational microsignatures, no dark mass concentrations, nothing. The fleet showed nothing. There was, in the sensor display, nothing in that region of space that had not been there before the Umbral arrived. The sequence was broken. Sol was still burning. He could not see it from here. They were 6.3 light-years from it, and the pod sensors had not recovered enough resolution to pick up a single stellar body at that range. But he knew it was there. He had done the math. The math was right. The math had been checked by Dara, who caught his errors, and by Yusuf, who knew binary stellar mechanics, and by Priya, who knew what stakes required of verification. Sol was still burning. He leaned his head back against the cradle and closed both eyes, and for a moment allowed himself nothing. No thought, no calculation, no next step. Just the silence of the pod, and the distant receding light of what had been HR 7440, and the darkness between stars which was the only darkness that should exist. Not the constructed darkness of the Umbral's conviction, not the silence they called cure, but the ordinary darkness of distance, of space, of the gaps between fires that had always been gaps and were not anyone's wound. The rescue took 11 hours. A hegemony patrol vessel caught their distress beacon at the edge of its detection range and came in with the particular confident urgency of a ship that has been told it is approaching survivors of a stellar detonation event and is not entirely certain what it will find. What it found was 2 small pods tumbling in loose formation in the expanding outer wave front of the largest supernova in recorded human history, both intact, all 4 occupants alive and stable, one with a head laceration that had been dressed with the contents of the emergency medical kit, one with forearm burns that had been treated and retreated, one with a bruised sternum that she was choosing not to mention, and one with eyes of 2 different colors who sat in the rescue vessel's med bay. For a long time after they were brought aboard without speaking. The med bay of the rescue vessel was a clean, bright room that smelled of antiseptic and filtered air, and the first thing Eli did when they put him in a recovery chair was ask for a display screen. The medic, a young man from Johannesburg who had not yet reached the age at which the Eli Varek type became familiar, the type that was not quite human enough for full comfort. He complied after a brief hesitation that Eli had stopped noticing, or had started noticing without feeling it anymore, which might amount to the same thing. Sol was still burning. He had known it would be. The math had been right. But knowing and seeing were different provinces, and when the stellar data came through on the display, Sol, G-type, 4.6 billion years old, luminosity nominal, all output metrics within normal parameters, he felt something unknot in his chest that he had not realized had been knotted, something that had been coiling tight since the moment the spiral revealed itself in the holographic display above his work table on the Meridian Cross. He sat with the data for a while. Priya was in the adjacent bay getting her head wound properly cleaned and sealed, and he could hear her talking to the medic. She had an endearing habit, under stress, of filling silence with information, of narrating her own situation in the voice of someone delivering a research paper, and he could hear her describing the events of the last 72 hours with the precise, clinical vocabulary of a xenologist who had survived something and was processing it through the only language she trusted. Yusuf was asleep. Dara had gone to the rescue vessel's bridge to speak with the captain, because Dara was the kind of person who, upon being rescued, immediately needed to speak with the person in charge. The hegemony command net was full of traffic about HR 7440. The detonation had, as anticipated, been registered by every stellar observatory in the galaxy with instruments pointed anywhere near that region of space. The wave front was propagating outward on a schedule that matched Eli's calculations closely enough to satisfy him. The node network around Sol had gone silent. Hegemony long-range probes were already being redirected to confirm, but the gravitational microsignatures were absent, the region clean. The alert status for Sol system had been downgraded from Level 9, the highest classification, Extinction Event Protocol, to Level 4, which was serious but manageable, which was the designation for threats that were understood and were not currently active. The colony at Kandara Station had not made it. He had known this since the Vesta 7 event, had held the fact at the appropriate distance while there was work to do, and was now, in the quiet of the med bay with the work completed, letting it be what it was. 312 people. He read their names in the register that the hegemony net had already assembled in the first stages of what would become a lengthy inquiry and commission and memorial process. He read the names without hurrying through them. He did not owe anyone this, and it would not change anything, and he did it anyway, because the names were real and he was the person who had identified the pattern and the person who had mapped the spiral and the person in whose calculations Vesta 7 had appeared as a candidate star and then been superseded by events, and the names were real. He sat with them for a while. Then he asked the display to give him a long-range view, the widest field available from the rescue vessel's external sensors, rotated to give him the full local stellar neighborhood, the constellation of nearby stars in their ordinary scattered arrangement, gold and cool and present. He looked at them for a long time. His amber eye catalogued them with the instinctive, involuntary precision that was his inheritance, tracking their positions, their proper motion vectors, their spectral classes, their distances. He was looking for the pattern. Could not stop looking for the pattern. It was the thing he was built for, the thing his father's blood had given him and his mother's science had shaped, and it would not turn off. The stars were there. All of them. Every one he could verify. He cross-referenced against the catalog, against the last pre-event survey data, against the observatory relay records. Every star in the local neighborhood was present and burning. The node network was gone. The Umbral fleet, or what had been the Umbral fleet, was gone. The sequence was broken. He let himself, very carefully, feel something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction but lived in the same general space. He had done the work. The work had been right. The people on Earth with their 7 billion ordinary days were still there, still going about them. His crewmates, who had trusted him, finally, who had made the decision with him and checked his numbers and caught his errors and launched into pods because he'd asked them to, were alive. The med bay was quiet. The stars were present. Dara came in from the bridge and sat down across from him, and she looked at the display screen he'd been watching, and she said nothing for a moment. "The captain wants a full debrief," she said. "Priya's already drafted an outline." "Of course she has," Eli said. Something almost like a smile crossed Dara's face, a provisional thing, testing the expression. "We lost the Meridian Cross," she said. "We did," he said. "The charter company is going to be livid." "Probably," he said. "Worth it," she said, quietly and without irony, and the way she said it made it something between an acknowledgment and an apology for every pause that had preceded it, for every beat of hesitation and every seat left empty and every calculation checked twice specifically because it was his, and he accepted it in the spirit it was offered. "Yes," he said. He looked back at the display. The stellar neighborhood lay out before him in its ancient arrangement, the same stars that human beings had named and studied and navigated by for all of recorded history, the same points of light that every civilization in the galaxy had looked up at and built stories from. He thought about the Umbral, about what it meant to be old enough to believe the universe had a correct state, to have watched enough of its history to construct a cosmology from it, to be so certain of your diagnosis that you would extinguish suns. He could not quite make himself hate them. Could find, somewhere in the inherited registers of his father's blood, something that recognized them as a form of conviction he understood, the conviction that what you saw was what was true, that the pattern you identified was the pattern that mattered, that you were equipped to know. He had that conviction himself. He had relied on it to save 8 billion people. The difference, the only difference, but it was an infinite difference, was that he had been right. He was still looking at the display when he saw it. A single star. Far out in the catalog, near the edge of the sensor field's resolution, a dim orange dwarf at the very threshold of detection, 14 light-years distant, in a direction that was not the direction of Sol, not the direction of the Umbral fleet's former position, not any direction that featured in his calculations or his map. Its luminosity had dropped to 0. He stared at the reading for a long moment. Checked the instrument calibration. Confirmed the reading against the secondary sensor array. Ran the timestamp and the spatial coordinates and cross-referenced them against his map of the broken spiral, against the known positions of the extinct network. This star was not in the spiral. It was not in the sequence. It was not in any region where the Umbral fleet had been operating. It was in a completely different part of the local stellar neighborhood. A new point of red. Somewhere new. He sat very still in the med bay of the rescue vessel, with Dara beside him and the display in front of him and the stars all around him, and he looked at the dark place where one small orange dwarf had been burning a moment ago, and he understood what it meant with the particular cold clarity of someone who has seen the shape of a pattern before and is seeing it again. They were still out there, and they were regrouping.